When I first met Daniel Moore, it felt like the universe had thrown me a lifeline. I wasn't looking for love. Truthfully, I'd built a life carefully designed to avoid entanglements, especially familial ones. My parents were long gone from my life, by choice, not death. I'd grown up learning that family could be just as cruel as strangers, and I had no intention of repeating old patterns. But Daniel, he was different. Smart, attentive, and so easy to laugh with. He made the idea of home feel like a possibility again. We met at a mutual friend's charity event. He was dressed in a navy blazer, holding a glass of something golden, and I remember thinking he looked like he belonged in a lifestyle magazine. He said he noticed me because I wasn't trying to get noticed. That was the kind of thing he said, simple, yet disarming. By the end of that night, I'd given him my number, not even realizing I'd broken one of my own rules. Our relationship progressed quickly, but naturally. He was charming, consistent, and kind. We talked about dreams, career ambitions, the kind of people we wanted to be in 10 years. I told him about my independence, how I built my design business from scratch, how I owned my condo outright, how I'd learned to stand on my own 2 feet. He said he admired that. He made me feel like I could trust someone again. Then I met his mother. Vivian Moore didn't look like anyone's idea of a monster. Perfectly coiffed hair, pearl earrings, a voice like sugar left out too long. But her eyes were always assessing. I knew immediately that she had a script for who Daniel should end up with, and I wasn't on the casting list. She smiled the first time we met, but it didn't reach her face. "Oh," she said, holding out her hand, "so you're the woman who's been keeping my son so busy." Her tone was playful, but her grip was ice. I laughed politely, choosing to brush it off. I told myself first impressions weren't always accurate. But it didn't stop. The little comments. The not-so-subtle jabs. One night over dinner, she brought up how Daniel's high school sweetheart, Claire, had kept herself in such great shape, even after college. She looked right at me as she said it, her eyes sweeping over my body in a silent critique. I could feel my cheeks burn. Daniel chuckled nervously and changed the subject. Another time, when we were all having lunch at a cafe she insisted on choosing, she leaned across the table and asked if I had any family nearby. When I said no, her mouth tightened just slightly. "That must be hard," she said, starting over from nothing. I knew what she meant. She wasn't just commenting on my life, she was evaluating it, labeling it as less than. Daniel always played the peacemaker. He'd squeeze my hand under the table or whisper, "Just ignore her," in the car afterward. He said she didn't mean it. That she was just old-fashioned. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe love was enough to smooth over the cracks. So when he proposed 6 months later, I said yes. I didn't let her ruin the moment. He took me to the hilltop park where we had our 3rd date, the one where we'd watched the sun dip beneath the skyline and talked about everything from college regrets to guilty pleasure TV shows. He got down on one knee, opened a velvet box, and asked me to be his forever. I said yes through happy tears, letting myself believe that I could have the fairy tale, even if a disapproving mother-in-law came with it. Vivian's reaction was immediate and theatrical. "Oh," she said, her eyes fixed on the ring. "How modest." Then she turned to me and added, "You must be thrilled, dear. This is such a step up for you." My stomach twisted. Daniel laughed it off, again, saying she was just being quirky. Later that night, I told him I needed him to set boundaries. I told him I wouldn't survive a marriage where I was constantly dodging insults from the woman who raised him. He hugged me, told me he understood, said he would talk to her. And maybe he did. But nothing changed. I tried not to let her chip away at me. I tried to focus on the good, on Daniel's warm hand in mine, on our shared plans, on the life we were about to build together. But deep down, I felt the quiet ache of a truth I didn't want to face. I wasn't just marrying Daniel. I was stepping into a silent war with a woman who had already decided I would never be enough. And worse, I was starting to suspect Daniel didn't know how to fight on my side. Planning a wedding is supposed to be a joyful experience, but with Vivian involved, it felt like walking barefoot across glass. The moment Daniel proposed, her passive-aggressive snipes turned into open hostility, cloaked in saccharine concern. "Oh, Emily," she said after we shared the news, "have you two really thought this through? Marriage is such a serious commitment, especially for people with unconventional upbringings." Her words landed like slaps I wasn't allowed to react to, and Daniel just stood there beside me, smiling awkwardly, like it was a mildly embarrassing dinner guest rather than his mother undermining our relationship. Then came the ring. I hadn't even looked at it with her yet before she took Daniel's hand, peered at it with a smug little grin, and said, "Well, it's sweet. A little small, maybe, but I'm sure Emily doesn't care about things like that." I could feel the blood rising in my face. I cared about the gesture, about what it meant, not the carrots. But she was planting seeds, trying to draw attention to every angle she could twist into a flaw. From there, it only got worse. The wedding plans became a battleground. Vivian inserted herself into every conversation, uninvited and unrelenting. I'd say I wanted something elegant and small, and she'd counter with guest lists that ballooned into the hundreds. "You don't want to exclude people, Emily," she'd say sweetly. "It's Daniel's big day too." When we chose a venue she hadn't approved, she threw a fit behind Daniel's back, telling me I was clearly trying to keep the Moore family at a distance. Each time I brought it up to Daniel, he'd sigh, rub the back of his neck, and say, "I know, she's being too much. I'll talk to her." Sometimes he did. But his words never held weight. She never truly stopped. She just adjusted the volume. And when she'd hurt me enough to leave me in tears, Daniel would comfort me half-heartedly and then drift back into denial. "That's just how she is," he kept saying. "She'll come around." I remember the day of my bridal fitting, Vivian showed up uninvited, again. She walked in with that icy smile, scanned the dress I was trying on, and said, "I suppose it works. Just be careful with the fabric around the hips. Some materials aren't very forgiving." I stared at her through the mirror, frozen in a mixture of rage and hurt. My consultant looked at me, uncertain whether to kick her out or offer me a box of tissues. When I confronted Daniel about it later, he barely reacted. "She probably didn't mean anything by it," he said, shrugging, flipping through emails on his phone. I remember how quiet the room felt, how distant he was. I had never felt so alone sitting next to someone I loved. Still, I pressed on, clinging to the hope that our wedding day would drown out the months of tension. I'd poured myself into every detail, desperate to create a moment that felt like ours. But of course, Vivian had one last move. She wore white. I walked into the chapel and saw her standing near the front row, hair perfectly styled, dress floor-length, and glaringly, defiantly white. It wasn't even ivory. It was snow white, with sequins that sparkled under the soft lights, drawing attention like a flare gun. My heart sank. There was no mistaking the message. This was her moment too, and she wasn't giving it up without a fight. People whispered. I could hear the guests murmuring as I made my way down the aisle. I kept my face composed, my steps steady, but inside, I was unraveling. When I reached Daniel, I expected, hoped, he would notice, that his face would mirror the shock and discomfort I felt. Instead, he gave me a smile, leaned in, and whispered, "You look beautiful." As if everything were normal. As if his mother hadn't just hijacked the most important day of our lives. I stood there, repeating my vows, while she sat smugly in the front row in a gown that matched my own. I tried to focus on Daniel, on the love I still believed we shared, but the truth was already blooming in the back of my mind like a bruise. His silence wasn't just silence. It was consent. He wasn't unwilling to stand up to her. He was unwilling to choose me. After the ceremony, during the reception, Vivian clinked her glass and gave a toast that made my stomach churn. "To Daniel," she said, raising her champagne, "who has always followed his heart, no matter what others thought." And to Emily, for being bold enough to step into our lives with such confidence. Her eyes locked on mine. I stared back, willing myself not to react, not to crumble in front of 100 people. Daniel laughed, and kissed my cheek like everything was fine. That night, I stared at the ceiling beside my new husband, listening to the soft rhythm of his breath as he fell asleep. I was supposed to feel like a wife, a partner, part of something sacred and solid. But all I felt was the weight of compromise and the sickening realization that I had just walked into a marriage where I'd always be second to a woman who'd already claimed his loyalty long ago. Pregnancy should have been a sacred time, a stretch of months wrapped in anticipation and wonder. Instead, it felt like a war zone where I was both the battlefield and the soldier, fighting off cruelty wrapped in concern, judgment masked as love. Vivian's behavior didn't just continue, it sharpened into something far more vicious. As soon as we shared the news, her eyes narrowed, like she was trying to spot the trick hiding behind our announcement. "Well," she said, lips pursed, "I suppose that was fast. I guess you wasted no time." The smile she forced afterward made my skin crawl. Daniel stood beside me, his hand on my lower back, but even then, I felt alone. He didn't say a word to defend me, just gave that same awkward chuckle he always did when she struck a nerve. At first, I chalked it up to shock. I told myself maybe she needed time to process the fact that she was going to be a grandmother. But time didn't make her softer. It made her sharper, more deliberate. Her comments came more often and carried heavier weight. She'd show up uninvited to doctor's appointments, then act offended when I didn't ask her to come inside. When I asked Daniel to talk to her, to set real boundaries, he sighed and said she was just excited. One afternoon, around my 5th month, she stopped by unannounced with a box of maternity clothes she claimed she'd picked out just for me. "I noticed your usual wardrobe's getting a bit snug," she said, her voice thick with condescension. I opened the box and felt heat rise up my neck. Everything inside was at least 2 sizes too large and entirely unflattering. It wasn't a gift. It was a message. I was letting myself go. When I gently handed the clothes back and said I preferred to choose my own, she pursed her lips and said, "Of course you do. You've always had that independent streak. I suppose that's fine, for someone in your position." She didn't have to say what she meant. I'd heard it all before. No family. No pedigree. Not what she wanted for her only son. Then came the comparisons. Claire Bennett. That name became a ghost in our house, whispered and reverent. Vivian mentioned her constantly, always with a wistful smile and a not-so-subtle point. Claire never sat around during her pregnancy, she told me once. She kept moving. That's why she looked so radiant even in her 3rd trimester. Another time, Claire used to bring me fresh-baked bread every week. She had such a generous heart. I asked Daniel, point blank, to shut it down. To tell his mother that whatever happened with Claire was in the past and that her comparisons were cruel. But all I got was a dismissive, "She doesn't mean anything by it. Don't let her get in your head." As if that were even possible anymore. She wasn't just in my head, she was in my home, in every conversation, in every echo of doubt that bounced around the walls of my mind. By the 7th month, things took a darker turn. Vivian began to insinuate things I couldn't believe even she had the gall to suggest. "You know, Daniel," she said one day while he and I were having lunch at her house, "these days, it's not uncommon for women to get distracted during pregnancy. Hormones make them do strange things." She looked directly at me when she said it, sipping her tea like she hadn't just accused me of cheating. I dropped my fork. "Are you implying I've been unfaithful?" I asked, my voice low, but charged. Vivian gasped, hand to her chest. "Oh goodness, no. I would never say that. I'm just pointing out what I've read. You know, hormones and all. It's so easy to misinterpret things when you're so emotional." She glanced at Daniel, clearly fishing for backup. And Daniel, my husband, looked down at his plate. He didn't defend me. He didn't challenge her. He just mumbled, "Let's not do this right now." That's when it really hit me. I was alone. Even with Daniel under the same roof, I was navigating this pregnancy in a fog of isolation. He started spending more time at his mother's house under the excuse of helping her out. He'd come home late, distracted, sometimes cold. If I cried or told him I felt abandoned, he'd brush it off with, "It's the hormones, Em." You're overthinking everything. It wasn't hormones. It was gaslighting. I began to dread waking up in the morning. Every call from Vivian was a landmine. Every moment with Daniel felt like trying to grip water with open palms. My baby was growing inside me, this small miracle I should have been cherishing, and yet I felt like I was shrinking, becoming invisible to the man who promised he'd stand beside me. One night, after he'd come home smelling like his mother's pot roast and Claire's perfume, don't ask how I knew, I just did, I sat alone in the nursery we hadn't finished. I ran my fingers over the edge of the crib, tears sliding down my face without permission. I whispered to the baby, I don't know what kind of world you're coming into, but I promise I'll protect you, even if it's just me. Because by then, I knew. I couldn't count on Daniel. I couldn't silence Vivian. But I could choose to fight back. Not for me, but for the little life growing inside me, who deserved so much better than this chaos masquerading as family. I used to count Daniel's footsteps when he came home, listening for the pattern that told me which version of him I was getting that night. Quick steps meant he was trying to make up for being gone too long. Slow, dragging ones meant he was tired of me, tired of my moods, as he'd taken to calling them. I was 7.5 months pregnant, carrying the weight of a child and the slow erosion of a marriage. He, meanwhile, had started spending more nights at his mother's house under the flimsiest excuses imaginable. She needed help with the plumbing, he said once. She's lonely another time. She's just stressed, you know how she gets. I knew how she got. She was a master manipulator, skilled at playing the fragile matriarch, the woman who had given everything and just wanted what's best for her son. But what she really wanted was me out of the picture. And Daniel, my Daniel, was letting her win. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I'd call to ask when he was coming home, and he'd let it ring 5, 6 times before answering, voice curt, distracted. Why are you always checking up on me? He snapped once. It's exhausting, Emily. I stared at my phone in disbelief. Exhausting? I was carrying our child, working reduced hours because I could barely stay upright some days, dealing with his mother's constant intrusions and cruelty. And I was the exhausting one? But every time I tried to talk to him about it, about how lonely I felt, how angry I was, how scared I was to bring a baby into a home filled with tension and distance, he flipped it around on me. You're overreacting, he said. This is just hormones talking. You're not thinking clearly. Hormones. That word became his shield, his excuse, his way out of every serious conversation. No matter how rational I was, how calm I tried to be, if I brought up anything that made him uncomfortable, it was dismissed as hormonal nonsense. I began to feel like I was losing my mind, like I couldn't trust my own emotions. The gaslighting was so subtle at first, I'd barely noticed it. But over time, it became more deliberate. If I mentioned something Vivian had said, like when she casually suggested Daniel keep a just-in-case bag packed in case the baby turned out not to be his, he'd say I must have misunderstood her. She would never say that, he insisted. Why are you always trying to start something? Because something had already started, Daniel. You just weren't paying attention. The days bled into each other, a dull mix of doctor's appointments, swollen ankles, and silence. I stopped trying to decorate the nursery. Every time I picked up a paintbrush or folded a onesie, I felt this ache in my chest, this sense that I was preparing a room for a baby to enter a house that wasn't a home. A house where his mother felt unwelcome. A house where his father couldn't be bothered to stay. One night, I found myself standing at the kitchen sink, staring out into the dark yard while Daniel's plate sat untouched on the counter. He hadn't come home again. I didn't bother calling. I just stood there, pressing my fingers into the edge of the countertop, willing myself not to cry. But the tears came anyway, hot, bitter, full of grief for a love I didn't recognize anymore. When he finally walked in close to midnight, he didn't even apologize. He tossed his keys into the bowl by the door and said, "You're still up," like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I waited, I said, quietly. For what? He asked. Emily, I told you I'd be at my mom's. What is this, a stakeout? I stared at him, stunned. You act like this is normal. Like leaving your pregnant wife alone for hours without a word is something I should just get used to. You are always so dramatic lately, he muttered, heading toward the bedroom. I followed him, heart pounding. Daniel, don't walk away from me. He stopped at the threshold, turned to face me. I'm tired, Emily. I can't keep dealing with your emotional roller coasters. Everything is always a crisis with you now. Maybe if you calmed down, things wouldn't feel so hard. And just like that, the last thread of hope I'd been clinging to snapped. I'm not making this hard, I said, my voice shaking. You are. Your mother is. This entire situation is crushing me, and you don't even see it. He shook his head, jaw tight. You're not yourself right now. No, I whispered. I'm just finally starting to see things clearly. He didn't respond. He just turned and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me standing alone in the hallway. And in that silence, I felt something shift, not in the baby, not physically, but deep in me. I realized I was no longer trying to save the marriage. I was trying to survive it. I placed a hand over my belly and whispered, "We're going to be okay, even if it's just us." Because more than anything, I knew I needed to protect this child, not just from the world, but from the toxic dynamics that were already creeping into his future. I didn't know exactly what came next, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the life I wanted. And I was finally ready to fight for the one we deserved. The contractions started just after 3 a.m., a low, steady pressure that spread through my lower back like a rising tide. At first, I wasn't sure it was real. I'd been feeling Braxton Hicks for weeks, those teasing false alarms that left me both relieved and disappointed. But this was different. There was an urgency to it, a rhythm that demanded attention. I sat up in bed, holding my breath as the next wave hit. This was it. I was going into labor. Daniel was asleep beside me, sprawled out, one arm dangling over the edge of the mattress. I reached out, touched his shoulder gently, then harder. "Daniel," I whispered. "Wake up. It's time." He stirred, groaned, rolled onto his back. "Now." "Yes, now," I said, already reaching for my hospital bag. "The contractions are close. We need to go." He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes like I'd interrupted a pleasant dream. No urgency, no concern. Just annoyance. All right. I'm getting up." The drive to the hospital was silent. I focused on my breathing while he gripped the steering wheel with both hands, eyes forward, like this was just another task he hadn't planned for. When we arrived, I expected some shift, some spark of protectiveness or excitement, but he remained detached, like he was checking me in for a dental cleaning instead of the birth of our child. Once we were settled into a room, things progressed quickly. The nurses moved efficiently, checking monitors, adjusting IVs. I was in pain but focused, determined to bring our son into the world with as much calm as I could muster. Then the door opened, and I felt the air in the room change. Vivian. She walked in like she owned the place, dressed in soft pink slacks, hair styled to perfection, clutching a designer handbag like she was attending a brunch instead of a birth. "I'm here," she announced brightly, as though anyone had invited her. I shot Daniel a look, my voice low but sharp. "Why is she here?" "She just wanted to be supportive," he said, avoiding my eyes. "She won't get in the way." But she already had. Every moment she was in the room was one where I felt exposed and unsafe. She hovered near the monitor, making little comments about the baby's heart rate. She asked the nurse unnecessary questions. And then, when I was at my most vulnerable, she positioned herself at the head of the bed like she belonged there. "I need her out," I told Daniel through gritted teeth as another contraction hit. "Now." He looked torn, hesitated. "Emily, don't make a scene. She's just trying to help." I wanted to scream, to rip the four from my arm and storm out of the room myself. Instead, I clenched my jaw, breathing through the pain, and stared at the ceiling as hot tears rolled down my cheeks. I had no control. Not over my body. Not over this moment. Not over the people surrounding me. And then Leo was born. The moment I saw him, the world stilled. He was perfect. Dark hair, round cheeks, tiny fists curled tight against his chest. I reached for him with trembling hands, everything else falling away. For one brief, glorious second, it was just me and my son. Until Daniel ruined it. He didn't smile. Didn't cry. He stood beside the bassinet, arms folded, eyes cool. Then, in front of the nurses, in front of me still covered in sweat and tears, he said it. I want a paternity test. Silence. The nurse holding Leo froze. I blinked, thinking I'd misheard, but he said it again, louder, more certain. I want a paternity test. Before we take him home. I'm not raising someone else's kid. I didn't feel the pain in my body anymore. Just the shock, cold and absolute. Vivian stood in the corner with a faint smirk, her eyes glinting with victory. I knew, without a doubt, she had put the idea in his head, planted it like a poison seed, and watched it grow. Are you serious? I whispered. My voice cracked, raw and hoarse. After everything. You think I'd do that to you? He didn't answer. Just looked away as if the shame belonged to me. The nurse cleared her throat gently, trying to usher him out of the room with medical protocol talk, but it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. The man I had married, the man I thought would be my partner, had just accused me of the worst betrayal at the most vulnerable moment of my life. When they handed Leo to me, I held him tighter than I ever had anything. He blinked up at me, unaware of the chaos around him, and I whispered through my tears, I've got you. No matter what. Daniel stood near the doorway now, arms still crossed, refusing to meet my eyes. Vivian had her hand on his shoulder, leaning in, whispering something only he could hear. I watched the two of them, the way she stood beside him like a puppet master, and I knew then what I hadn't wanted to believe before. She had turned him against me. And he had let her. The envelope felt heavier than it should have, like the truth inside had weight. I held it in my lap as I sat on the edge of the bed, Leo asleep in the bassinet beside me, his tiny chest rising and falling with the rhythm of innocence. The hospital room was cold and quiet. Daniel hadn't come back since the night he demanded the paternity test. He'd said he needed time. I hadn't argued. After what he'd accused me of, there was nothing left to say. A nurse had delivered the results that morning with a sympathetic look I couldn't quite interpret. I waited until Leo fell asleep before I tore the envelope open with trembling hands. Negative. The word stared up at me in sterile black ink. Not a match. According to this test, Daniel Moore was not the father of my child. I stopped breathing. My hands started to shake. My mind went blank for a moment, like it couldn't process something so absurd. I looked at Leo, those same eyes as Daniel, that same little wrinkle between his brows when he fussed. How could this be? It didn't make sense. I hadn't been with anyone else. Not once. Not ever. My first thought wasn't betrayal. It was confusion. Then panic. Then something colder, something primal and terrified. Something was wrong. I stood and stared at the test again, hoping it would change, that the paper would somehow correct itself. But it didn't. And Daniel? He didn't even wait for me to explain. Once the results were shared with him, he blocked my number. No calls, no messages, no apology. Just silence. He hadn't even come to see Leo again. As if the child he once promised to love no longer existed. As if I'd become invisible the moment the test confirmed his mother's poison. It was a few days later when I got the call. I was sitting in the rocking chair, watching Leo sleep, exhaustion clinging to my bones like a second skin. My phone buzzed, and I almost didn't answer when I saw Vivian's name. But something made me pick up, curiosity, rage, or maybe the part of me that still wanted answers. Her voice was calm. Too calm. I wanted you to know, she said. I did it. I sat up straighter. What are you talking about? The test. I had it changed, she said, like she was confessing to ordering the wrong flowers for a party. I have a friend at the lab. I asked for a little switch. Just to be sure. My mouth went dry. You, what? I never liked you, Emily, she continued, her tone almost sweet. And I didn't think you deserved him. Or this baby. You weren't raised right. You don't understand loyalty tradition. You were never going to be part of this family. I was frozen. My mind couldn't catch up to her words. You lied to your son, I whispered. You tore a family apart. She didn't flinch. I protected my son from a life of mediocrity. He's finally listening now. He's better off. My voice turned cold. He abandoned his child. That's what you think is better. She scoffed. Daniel deserves someone who enhances him, not drags him down. You were a mistake. This baby was your trap. But now it's over. I hung up without another word, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I stood over Leo's bassinet, looking down at him, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. He stirred, just slightly, as if he sensed something. I brushed my finger against his soft little hand, and he curled his tiny fingers around mine. He was real. He was mine. And I knew then what I had to do. Vivian had crossed a line. And Daniel had let her. It didn't matter if he'd been manipulated. He had chosen to believe a lie, to abandon us, to accuse me at my most vulnerable. I couldn't undo the damage, but I could take control of what came next. I called a lawyer the next morning. I want to talk about custody, I said. And divorce. The receptionist didn't ask questions. She scheduled a consultation, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to strength return to my voice. I would not let Leo grow up thinking love looked like this. I would not let him be raised in the shadow of people who twisted the truth to suit their narrative. He deserved better. And so did I. Later that day, Nina stopped by, my coworker, my quiet hero. She brought a casserole and a soft smile, and when she saw the state I was in, tired, broken, unraveling, she didn't ask questions. She just hugged me, cleaned my kitchen, and held Leo like he was the most precious thing in the world. You don't have to do this alone, she said gently. I already am, I whispered. She shook her head. No, not anymore. It wasn't everything. It didn't fix the betrayal or erase the pain. But it was something, a spark of light in the wreckage. Vivian had tried to destroy me. Daniel had let her. But they underestimated one thing. I wasn't the kind of woman who stayed broken. I was the kind who rebuilt. Stronger, smarter, and more determined than ever to protect the one thing they could never take from me, my son. The first morning I woke up without checking my phone for Daniel's texts was the morning I started to breathe again. It wasn't that I no longer cared, I just no longer expected anything. No calls. No apologies. No explanations. Just quiet. The kind that used to scare me but had slowly become comforting. I had Leo now, and Leo needed me to be strong, not stuck waiting for a man who had turned his back on us without hesitation. Nina had become my lifeline. She stopped by every few days, bringing groceries, coffee, or just her presence, which had a way of grounding me. She never treated me like I was fragile, though I knew she could see how hollowed out I felt some days. Instead, she saw the fight in me, even when I couldn't. She held Leo like he was part of her own family and reminded me that not all connections needed to be bound by blood to be real. The day we walked into the lawyer's office, I had Leo strapped to my chest in a sling and a binder of documents Nina had helped me organize. The receptionist gave me a sympathetic smile as we waited. I sat upright, shoulders back, heart pounding. I had to keep reminding myself that I wasn't doing this out of revenge, I was doing it to survive. To protect my son from ever thinking that abandonment was something he had to accept. My attorney, Carla, was a woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice. She reviewed everything as I spoke, nodding in all the right places, but never once reacting with pity. When I told her about the paternity test Vivian had tampered with, about Daniel's accusation, about the phone call that confirmed it all, she asked only one question. Do you want full custody? I didn't hesitate. Yes. She nodded, jotting down notes. We'll include that in the divorce petition, sole legal and physical custody. You'll have to be prepared for him to contest it, especially if he realizes what his mother did. I don't care if he contests it, I said, voice low. He didn't just walk out on me. He walked out on Leo. And I won't let my son grow up thinking that's love. That night, I sat on the couch, Leo asleep against my chest, and stared at the manila folder Carla had given me. Inside was the first draft of my new future, The divorce papers, the custody filing, the first real step toward freedom. I was terrified, yes, but also relieved. For the first time in months, I was choosing myself, not just reacting to what Daniel and Vivian threw at me. The next few weeks were a blur of adjustment. Late-night feedings, lawyer calls, check-ins with Nina, moments of grief tangled in moments of hope. I started keeping a notebook by the bed, writing down everything I was too tired to say out loud. Sometimes it was a letter to Leo, other times it was a scream into the pages. But it helped. It made me feel like I had control over something again. Then came the unexpected knock at the door. It was a Sunday afternoon. Leo was napping in his bassinet, and I was finally eating lunch with the TV playing softly in the background. When I opened the door, the last person I ever expected to see was standing there. Daniel. He looked terrible. Disheveled hair, dark circles under his eyes, clothes wrinkled and loose on his frame. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then he exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "Emily," he said. "I need to talk to you." I didn't move. "I don't think you have anything left to say. I know what my mother did." I felt the words before I fully processed them. My entire body tensed. "You know." He nodded. "My dad told me." Vivian admitted it to him, bragged about it, even. He came to me last week. Said he couldn't watch her destroy another relationship over her obsession with control. Said I needed to know the truth. "And now you're here?" I asked. "After all this time?" "I believed her," he whispered. "I was wrong. I was so wrong." I crossed my arms, the paper-thin calm I'd been clinging to cracking beneath the surface. "You didn't just believe her, Daniel. You accused me. You humiliated me. You left me when I needed you most." He looked at Leo through the cracked door, eyes filling with something, regret, maybe, or recognition. I didn't know how much damage I'd done until I saw the test results. Until I saw him again in my father's arms. "He looks just like me." "You should have known without a test," I said, my voice shaking. "You should have trusted me." He swallowed hard. "I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I want to be a father to him. Please." I stood there, unsure whether to slam the door or collapse. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell him it was too little, too late. But another part, the mother in me, knew I needed to make the next move with clarity, not emotion. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, voice steady. "And I'm seeking full custody. You can talk to my lawyer." He blinked. "Wait, Emily. I'm done negotiating with people who didn't show up when it counted," I said. "You want to be in Leo's life? Then prove it. Through the courts. Not my doorstep." And with that, I closed the door, heart pounding, hand still trembling on the knob. I walked back to Leo and picked him up, holding him close. He stirred slightly and sighed. "We're okay," I whispered. "We're more than okay." Because no matter what came next, I finally knew my worth. And I would never let anyone question it again. Daniel kept trying. Messages. Calls. Flowers dropped at the door with notes like, "Please, just talk to me," and "I miss our family." But I didn't respond. Not because I was indifferent, but because I finally understood that an apology wasn't a repair. Not when the damage ran this deep. Not when he had stood by and watched his mother dismantle our life without lifting a finger to stop her. Still, when Carla called and said he'd requested a meeting through his lawyer, I agreed. I wanted everything on record, every word documented. We met in her office conference room, a space filled with glass, legal pads, and quiet tension. I walked in holding Leo, confident in my decision, but my heart clenched when I saw Daniel rise to his feet. He looked like a shadow of the man I once loved, leaner, tired, the polished veneer gone. His eyes locked on Leo instantly, softening in a way that twisted something inside me. But I didn't smile. I didn't hand over my child. I sat down and held Leo close, letting Carla open the conversation. Daniel's lawyer went first. My client would like to express his deepest regret for the events surrounding the paternity test. He was misled, intentionally, by his mother, and upon learning the truth, he has made every effort to reconcile and take responsibility. Daniel nodded, his voice low and hoarse when he finally spoke. I'm not here to fight. I know what I did. I know I left you, both of you, at the worst possible time. I was weak. I let my mother poison everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, Emily, but I want to be in Leo's life. I need to be. I watched him carefully. He sounded sincere. But sincerity doesn't undo harm. You didn't just leave, Daniel, I said quietly. You abandoned me in a hospital bed. You asked for a paternity test before I'd even held our son for a full hour. Then you disappeared. And now you want to walk back in and play dad? His face crumbled. I know. I deserve your anger. I can't take back what I did. But I want to make things right. I've been seeing a therapist. I've cut off contact with my mother. I've moved out of her house. You moved in with her? I asked, stunned. He winced. After the test. I didn't know what else to do. She said she'd support me, help me start over. But once I saw what she really was, how proud she was of what she did, I left. My dad told me everything. How she's done this before. How she drove away anyone who ever got too close. It hit me harder than I expected. Vivian had made me feel like the villain for so long, I'd started to believe her version of me was real. But now I saw that I wasn't the first casualty, just the one who finally fought back. I'll take another test, Daniel added quickly. An independent lab. You don't have to do anything. I'll handle it all. I nodded. Fine. Do it. But it doesn't change my position. I'm filing for primary custody and requesting supervised visitation. You can be in Leo's life, but not unsupervised. Not yet. Carla slid the papers across the table, divorce filings, custody terms, everything we'd discussed. Daniel's hands trembled as he looked them over, but he didn't argue. He just signed. Where is she now? I asked suddenly. Vivian. He looked up, eyes dark. I cut her off completely. She tried to come by last week. I told her if she ever came near me again, I'd file a restraining order. She's furious. But it's over. I didn't believe that. Not fully. Vivian didn't seem like the type to disappear quietly. But I wasn't afraid of her anymore. She couldn't touch us now. When the meeting ended, Daniel stood slowly. Can I hold him? Just for a moment. I hesitated. Leo was awake now, watching the room with wide, curious eyes. I studied Daniel's face, looking for cracks, for lies. But all I saw was sorrow and longing. Carefully, I stood and placed Leo in his arms. Daniel held him like he was something fragile and sacred. His hands shook. His eyes glistened. And then Leo reached up and touched his father's jaw with one tiny hand, like he knew this was a moment. I'm so sorry, Daniel whispered, kissing his forehead. I'm so sorry. When I took Leo back, I felt the weight of the past few months settle in my chest. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the loneliness, but also the strength. The fire that had carried me through. Back at home, I rocked Leo in our worn armchair and stared out the window as dusk settled in. The legal process had only just begun, but emotionally, the chapter had closed. Daniel could be part of Leo's life on my terms. And Vivian? She was gone from our world for good. It wasn't the ending I'd once dreamed of. But it was the one I chose. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not because the wounds had healed, but because I'd finally stopped letting the people who caused them define me. Leo cooed softly, his hand curling around my thumb. I smiled. We're going to be okay, I whispered. Because we always were, long before they realized it. The second paternity test came back with 3 simple words that said what I had known in my bones all along. Daniel is the father. I stared at the paper for a long time, not because I needed confirmation, but because seeing it, black ink on white, felt like justice. Not just for me, but for Leo. For the weeks of doubt. For every moment I held him knowing that love, not a lab result, made apparent. Daniel's lawyer sent the results directly to Carla. I didn't call him. I didn't send a message. The truth was now part of the court record. There would be no more tests, no more questions, no more space for Vivian's manipulations to thrive. The facts stood. But so did my resolve. I served the final divorce papers 2 days later. Carla filed the full custody request along with supervised visitation. No loopholes, no flexibility. I didn't care if it made me look harsh. I didn't care if Daniel cried in court or if his lawyer begged for leniency. He had walked out when I needed him most, and now he'd have to earn his way back, not into my life, but into Leo's. When he was served, Daniel didn't call. He showed up at my doorstep that night, his face pale and drawn, the weight of finality written across his features. I opened the door only as far as the latch would allow. "You got the results," I said, before he could speak. He nodded. I did. Silence stretched between us, taut and brittle. "I signed the divorce papers," he said. "And I'll accept the custody arrangement. I just want to be in his life. However I can." I watched him closely. For once, there were no excuses in his eyes. No anger. Just grief. I think he finally understood that some damage leaves scars too deep for any apology to reach. "You'll be supervised," I reminded him. "No solo visits. No drop-ins. Everything through the court." "I know," he whispered. "Whatever it takes. And you will never speak to Vivian again. Not about me. Not about Leo. Not ever." His voice cracked. "I haven't said a word to her since the day I found out. I meant what I said. She's out of my life." I nodded slowly and closed the door. After he left, I sat on the floor in Leo's nursery, back against the wall, and let the tears come. Not because I was sad or uncertain, but because everything had finally settled. The storm had passed. And now I could begin again, not as someone abandoned or betrayed, but as a woman who had drawn the line and meant it. I watched Leo sleep, his tiny fingers twitching in dreams, and felt a surge of pride. Not because I had done everything perfectly, God knows I hadn't, but because I had fought for him. For us. I had protected our peace. The next day, Nina came over with bagels and her signature no-nonsense energy. "You look lighter," she said as she handed me coffee. "I feel it," I admitted. "It's done. It's really done." She smiled, soft but proud. "You've been through hell, Emily. But you came out standing." "I don't feel like I won," I said quietly. Nina shook her head. "It's not about winning. It's about reclaiming what's yours. Your voice, your worth, your power." I looked around the apartment. It still held echoes of the life I had tried to build with Daniel, photos I hadn't yet removed, a few of his books tucked on a shelf, but it didn't feel like his space anymore. It was mine, and it was time to start fresh. Later that week, I packed up what little I wanted to keep and started researching places to move. Not far, just far enough to give Leo and me a new beginning. A place with no ghosts in the walls. Somewhere we could build memories untainted by betrayal. Before we left, I took down the last wedding photo still hanging in the hallway. I stared at it for a moment, me in white, Daniel smiling beside me, Vivian blurred in the background, her white dress practically glowing. It felt like looking at strangers. A staged performance of a love that never stood a chance. I slipped it into a box marked Donate. As I loaded Leo into the car, I whispered a quiet promise. No more shadows. Just light. That weekend, I signed the lease on a sunlit apartment in a quiet part of town, not too far from Nina and close enough to Leo's future daycare. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. And the silence felt different there, peaceful instead of heavy. Daniel had his first supervised visit the following week. It was awkward, tentative. But I watched from the adjacent room as he held Leo, sang to him, told him stories about when he was a boy. I didn't feel rage anymore. Just distance. Like we had shared a chapter, but the book had closed. When the visit ended, Daniel looked at me. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me try." I nodded but didn't speak. That was the most I could offer. Because I was no longer a woman waiting for someone to change. I was the woman who changed everything for herself. The first time I stepped into our new apartment with Leo nestled on my hip, it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a year. It wasn't grand, 2 bedrooms, white walls still bearing the faint smell of fresh paint, hardwood floors that creaked under my heels, but it was clean, quiet, free, and best of all, it was mine. I set Leo down on a blanket in the living room and looked around at the half-unpacked boxes, the sunlight pouring in through the wide windows, and the tiny stack of welcome papers from the leasing office. It was nothing like the house Daniel and I had shared. No sweeping staircase, no perfectly curated decor, but it didn't carry the ghosts of whispered accusations or the echo of silence after another door slammed. This place was a beginning. Nina came by that evening with Thai takeout and champagne, insisting we toast with plastic cups to freedom and fresh starts. Leo slept in his crib, the one I had put together myself, while we sat cross-legged on the floor, eating noodles and laughing for the first time in what felt like ages. "You know what I realized?" I said, twirling a forkful of pad CEW. "I haven't missed Daniel. Not really. I miss the idea of him. The version I thought I was marrying." Nina nodded. "That's the part people don't understand. You don't mourn the person. You mourn the hope you had in them." She was right. So much of what I grieved wasn't Daniel himself, but the promise of partnership I thought I was building. The life we were supposed to have. But that version of Daniel, loving, present, protective, had never truly existed. And when Vivian pushed, he folded. Vivian, of course, hadn't gone quietly. Word got around that she was furious about the custody ruling, humiliated by the fact that her actions had come to light. She tried once, just once, to contact me again, leaving a voicemail that started sweet and spiraled into venom. I deleted it before it ended. She wasn't going to infect this new life. Not now. Not ever. Daniel continued his supervised visits with Leo. They were cordial. Predictable. I no longer watched from the next room, no longer felt that anxious flutter every time he smiled at our son. Whatever guilt he carried, he bore it quietly. And I let him. He asked once, hesitantly, if I'd ever consider co-parenting. I told him honestly, I'd consider it when trust could be rebuilt, and that wasn't something I owed him on a timeline. He understood. Or at least pretended to. I spent my days learning how to navigate single motherhood, balancing client emails with feedings, naps with invoices, and sleepless nights with the kind of stubborn love that keeps you upright even when your body screams for rest. Leo gave me purpose. His every coo and gurgle reminded me why I had fought so hard. Some days were harder than others. There were nights I'd lie awake, not from heartbreak but from reflection, tracing back the red flags I had ignored. The moments I'd swallowed discomfort just to keep the peace. I thought about Vivian's smirks, her white dress at my wedding, her whispered lies. I thought about Daniel's quiet complicity, the way he had always shrugged instead of stood. And I made a promise to myself. Never again. Never again would I ignore my instincts just to be accepted. Never again would I let someone else's approval validate my worth. Never again would I quiet myself for the comfort of others. If motherhood had taught me anything, it was that protecting peace is an active choice, one I would make every day for myself and for Leo. A few months later, as autumn rolled in and leaves painted the sidewalks in fiery shades of gold and orange, I joined a local mom group Nina had found. At first, I was hesitant. Part of me feared the judgment, the pity, the subtle interrogations masked as small talk. But it turned out to be nothing like that. The women were raw and real, showing up in leggings and messy buns with stories of cracked nipples and toddler tantrums and moments of doubt so familiar it made me ache. They didn't care about my last name. They didn't ask about my marital status. They just cared that I showed up. I found community in that circle, people who understood the exhaustion and the quiet victories, who brought casseroles when Leo had a fever and offered babysitting trades when I landed a big design contract. They became my tribe and I theirs. On Leo's first birthday, I threw a small party in the park. Balloons tied to the picnic table, a smash cake Nina insisted on baking, and a circle of laughter, not tension. Daniel came, at my invitation. He brought a small gift, a wooden train set, and stood on the sidelines, quiet but present. I let him hold Leo. I even thanked him for coming. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't friendship. It was boundaries with kindness. Distance with civility. After the party, I drove home with Leo asleep in the back seat and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not just for surviving, but for becoming someone I hadn't known I could be. Mother, provider, protector, and woman, wholly her own. I parked the car, carried Leo upstairs, and kissed his forehead as I laid him down in his crib. The city lights glowed outside our window, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel trapped. I felt free. I stood there for a moment, whispering a final promise into the night. We don't live in the shadows of other people's choices anymore. We make our own light now. And in the soft stillness of that new life, I believed it with everything I had.